She was 19 years old, and she had $31, a sleeping bag, and a deed to a property nobody in Dunmore County had wanted to touch. The Cooper's shop on Sutter Mill Road had been sitting empty for 16 years. The county had tried to sell it twice, and both times the listing had expired without a single serious inquiry. They dropped the price to $1. May Colton was the first person who had sat in the assessor's chair and said yes. Everyone expected her to be gone by the first frost. Some people said she wouldn't last the first week, but what none of them knew, not the assessor's clerk who had stamped her deed with the mild surprise of a man who had stopped expecting the world to do anything unusual, not the neighbors who slowed their trucks on Sutter Mill Road to look, was that something was standing behind the barrel stack at the far end of that shop. Something that had been there since before May was born, placed by a man who had understood something about patience that most people spend their whole lives missing. Something that would not just give May Colton a life she couldn't have imagined. It would quietly, without a single word of confrontation, make every person who had ever dismissed her reconsider everything they thought they knew. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, and we hope this one does, please consider subscribing to Quiet Road Stories. The button is just below, and it only takes a second. And drop a comment to tell us where you're listening from tonight. We read every single one, and we love knowing where our listeners are. Now let's go back to the beginning of May Colton's story. She had not been the kind of child who caused trouble. She had been, if anything, the opposite. The kind of child who anticipates what a room needs and provides it before anyone asks, who learns to make herself useful because useful things are kept and useless things are set aside. She had grown up in a farmhouse at the north end of Dunmore County with her grandmother, her Aunt Lila, and Lila's husband, a man named Birch Hadley, who had come into the family the way weather comes into a room through a poorly fitted door, gradually, pervasively, and without ever quite being invited. Her grandmother, Dorothea Colton, had been the reason the house felt like home. Dorothea was a woman of few words and consistent actions, who woke early and kept things in their places and cooked from memory and could fix most things that broke using other things that were already on hand. She had raised May with a matter-of-fact tenderness, not sentimental, but present, reliable, the kind that shows up every morning and doesn't make a production of it. May had learned most of what she knew from watching Dorothea work, how to mend rather than replace, how to be patient with difficult materials, how to read a situation before acting on it. Dorothea died the month before May turned 16. She left the farmhouse to Lila, which was her right and reasonable by most measures. And she left May a folded $50 bill tucked inside a birthday card that read, in handwriting shaped by decades of penmanship practice, "You are the steadiest person I know. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." May kept the card. She spent the $50 on groceries the following winter, when Birch had come home from 3 weeks of contract work in a mood that made the farmhouse feel dangerous and the alternative, asking him for anything, feel worse. She had learned early that Birch's generosity, such as it was, had a ledger attached to it, and that everything given was eventually recalled with interest. She worked at a hardware store in town from the time she was 16, after school and all-day Saturdays. She was good at the work in the quiet, competent way of someone who likes problems with solutions. A customer wanted to know why their drain kept backing up, and May could trace the cause and describe the fix without condescending, and they came back and asked for her specifically. The manager, Holt, told her more than once she had a future in the trade if she wanted it. She had been saving toward a future in something, she wasn't sure what yet, only that savings were the same as options. She had $940 when she turned 19. Accumulated shift by shift. She had plans for it. She did not get to use it for that. Birch had a disposition that grew worse as it became more comfortable. By the time May was 19, he had settled so completely into the farmhouse that it was difficult to remember, from the inside, that it had ever been anything other than his. He made small decisions and large ones with the confidence of ownership. And Lila, who had her own sadnesses and her own reasons for choosing accommodation over resistance, followed his lead the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. When Birch decided, in February, that the room May slept in was needed for a project he was planning. A workroom, he said. Something for his gear. He announced it at the dinner table on a Wednesday and said she could have 2 weeks. She was out in 4 days. She took the sleeping bag, the card from her grandmother, and $31 in cash. She left the $940 where they were, in the account, because accounts required addresses, and she did not yet have one, and she told herself she'd deal with it when she had a place to stand. She drove her car to the hardware store parking lot and sat in it until Holt arrived at 7 in the morning, and she asked him, standing in the cold beside the unlocked door, if he knew of anywhere she could sleep for cheap. He didn't, but he knew a woman named Patsy who rented a room above her garage for $200 a month and had done so for 30 years and had never once been a problem to anyone who wasn't first a problem to her. He wrote down Patsy's number on a receipt tape. May called from the parking lot. Patsy answered on the 3rd ring, said the room was empty, and gave her the address. The room was small and cold and had a view of a gravel yard and a dead apple tree. May moved in that afternoon. She paid the first month with 4 of her $940, which she had transferred to cash at the bank that morning. She ate the sandwich Holt's wife had sent over without being asked, and she sat on the narrow bed and looked at the gravel yard and thought clearly and carefully about what came next. She found the county's delinquent property list at the library 2 weeks later. She had been reading about small business licensing when a link took her to the county assessor's website and a tab she had never noticed before. Most of the properties were odd-shaped parcels too narrow to build on. 3 were structures. The one that stopped her was listed as a former cooperage on Sutter Mill Road. Single main structure, attached outbuilding, 1 pound 8 acres, delinquent taxes $5,890, transfer price $1. She wrote down the address. The drive took 12 minutes. She almost missed the property because the sign was gone, just the post remaining, tilted toward the ditch. The building sat 30 feet back behind a stand of cedar that had grown up unchecked over 16 years and made the shop nearly invisible from the road. In February, the cedars were thin enough to see through. She pulled over and looked. The main structure was timber-framed, the siding weathered to a deep gray, the roof sheathed in cedar shakes that had gone mossy and dark with age. It was a single-story building, longer than it was wide, with a double door at the front tall enough for loaded barrels to pass through. One of the doors had come off its lower hinge and leaned against the frame at an angle. Behind the main structure, connected by a short covered passage open on one side, was the outbuilding, smaller, lower roofed, what might have been a finishing or storage area. Between the 2 buildings, in the passage, she could see the shapes of old barrels stacked against the wall. 3 of them, maybe 4. Too dark to tell. She got out of the car and walked to the door. She pushed it and it moved, the leaning door shifting on its intact upper hinge. She stepped inside. The smell came first, oak. Decades of oak, wood shavings and stave timber, and the deep humid sweetness of wood that has been worked and steamed and bent and allowed to cure for a very long time. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was specific in the way that the smells of old workshops are specific, each one recording, in its own way, what had been done there and how long it had taken. The main floor was a single long space, lit by 4 windows running along the south wall, 2 of which had lost their glass and been covered with plywood from the inside. Workbenches lined both walls, fitted with the specialized vises and jigs of coopering work, stave molds, crow's planes, bung borers, trussing hoops hanging from wall pegs like oversized bracelets, a steam box along the back wall, its pipe still running to a chimney breast. And along the north wall, A full complement of barrel forms in graduated sizes, from small casks to full-sized hogsheads, hung on iron brackets like sleeping things. She walked the length of the floor slowly. She was 19 years old. She had $31 in a savings account and a room above a garage. She had no knowledge of coopering and no particular reason to believe she could learn it. She stood in the middle of that floor, which smelled of oak and thyme and the particular industry of someone who had worked there every day for a long time, and she made the decision the way she had learned to make most decisions, not by weighing everything until certainty arrived, but by asking herself the simpler question: what was the alternative? The alternative was Patsy's room and the hardware store, and a life that was fine but belonged, in some structural sense, to the gaps other people had left. This building, for $1, could belong to her in a way that nothing had since her grandmother's kitchen. She drove back to town and went to the assessor's office. The clerk was a young woman named Sonia, cheerful and efficient, who pulled up the property without any particular expression of surprise and laid out the terms the same way a person describes bus schedules: accurate, complete, without commentary on the wisdom of the journey. May asked if there had been other inquiries. Sonia said there had been two, both years ago, neither of which had proceeded past a single visit. She said the property had been relisted twice. She said, with the mild diplomacy of someone delivering useful information without editorializing, that the last assessor's note described the structure as sound but requiring attention. May asked what attention it required most. Sonia checked the file. The door, she said. May signed the documents on a Friday morning. She drove to the hardware store, used her employee discount on a set of heavy-duty hinge hardware and a box of structural screws, and drove to Sutter Mill Road. She rehung the leaning door herself, working alone, by noon. Then she went back to Patsy's, packed her things, and moved into the shop. She slept the first 2 nights in her sleeping bag on the floor of the outbuilding, which was drier than the main structure, and had a small wood stove she'd found in the corner, still functional, still holding a supply of dry wood stacked against the wall, as if someone had expected to be back and simply hadn't made it. If you're still with us, we're so glad you are. Before we get to what was waiting behind those barrels, and it was more than anyone expected, please subscribe to Quiet Road Stories if this story is meaning something to you tonight. We're about to reach the part that changed everything for May Colton, and we'd love for you to be there for it. The first neighbor to come to the door was a man named Court Ulmer, 63, who ran a small cattle operation 2 properties down the road, and who appeared on the 3rd morning with a covered pot of beef soup, and the manner of someone who had decided the visit was practical rather than social, and was proceeding on that basis. He set the pot on the nearest workbench and looked around the shop with the inventory-taking gaze of a man who has assessed many properties in his time. "You're the new owner," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," May said. He nodded. He picked up a jig from the bench and looked at it and set it down again. "You know what this place was?" She told him she knew it was a cooperage. "Aldous Vane," he said. 41 years he ran this shop. Made barrels for the wineries over the ridge, made aging casks for 3 different distilleries, did repair work for anyone who needed it. He was the last working cooper in this part of the state, far as I know. He paused. Died 16 years ago. His daughter was in Duluth, didn't want the property. Let the estate sit until the county took it for back taxes. Nobody from around here could figure out what to do with it either. He looked at May with the directness of a man who had arrived at the age where indirect approaches seem like a waste of time. "What are you planning to do with it?" May said she was going to figure that out. Court looked at her. She was 19, visibly alone, standing in a shop full of tools she clearly didn't yet know how to use. He didn't say anything about any of that. He said, "The wood stove in the outbuilding draws better with the damper set to 3/4. Any further and it smokes." He picked up his pot. "Come by if you need anything." Wife's name is Frances. She'll feed you." He left. Frances Ulmer did feed her, not immediately and not out of charity in any way that felt like charity, but in the manner of a woman who cooked for people because she considered it a reasonable thing to do. She appeared 4 days later with a casserole and stayed long enough to establish that she knew something about the property's history, that she had known Aldous Vane to wave to for 40 years and to speak to occasionally, and that she had strong opinions about county building codes and their application to historic commercial structures, which turned out to be immediately relevant and useful information. Over the following weeks, May inventoried the shop with the thoroughness she'd brought to every task since she was old enough to be given them. She worked from front to back, cataloging each tool and jig and form, photographing everything with her phone, cross-referencing against a library book on coopering she'd ordered through interlibrary loan, and which arrived dog-eared and underlined from whoever had borrowed it last. She learned the names: the adze and the drawknife and the crow's plane, the bung borer and the shiv and the swift. She learned what each was for by looking at the marks it had left on the surfaces of the tools and forms around it, the way the tools had taught the wood and the wood had taught the tools, back and forth over 4 decades. And then, on the 22nd day, she moved the barrel stack. She had been building toward it. The stack stood against the far wall of the covered passage between the main shop and the outbuilding. 4 old barrels, 2 on the bottom and 2 on top, all of them decommissioned, their staves cracked or their heads missing. She had been leaving them until she understood the space well enough to know what she was looking at. On the 22nd day, she understood enough. She moved the front 2 barrels out into the yard. Then the back 2. Behind them, set into the wall of the passage, was a door she hadn't known was there. It was plain board construction, unpainted, fitted flush to the wall between 2 upright timbers so neatly that without the barrels gone it was effectively invisible. A simple iron latch, no lock. She lifted the latch and the door opened inward without difficulty, moving on hinges that had been oiled and were still oiled, which was the first thing that surprised her, because everything else in the shop had the oxidized resistance of things left too long without attention. The room on the other side was small, 8 feet square, perhaps, low-ceilinged, dry, which was the second thing that surprised her, given 16 years of vacancy. And along every wall, floor to ceiling, built-in shelving, and on the shelving, in careful order, the contents of Aldous Vane's life's work. Not barrels. Records, ledgers, 31 of them, their spines labeled in a handwriting that was large and unhurried, year ranges, client names, order numbers. Beside them, in flat archival boxes of the kind sold by library supply companies, technical drawings, stave geometry, hoop dimensions, grain orientation diagrams, steam bending curves, curing schedules for different wood species, stack after stack of them, covering 41 years of production. And beside the drawings, in a row of identical gray cardboard boxes, sample sets, actual staves, labeled and dated, cut thin enough to show the grain, annotated with penciled notes. Wood from coopered vessels that had aged bourbon for 8 years. Wood from wine casks that had gone 20. Wood from a batch of cider barrels Aldous had made for an orchard operation that had since closed, the staves still faintly fragrant. On the lowest shelf, centered, was a single ledger separated from the others. Its cover was plain, unmarked. Inside, on the first page, in the same unhurried handwriting, it said, "For whoever finds this room. The skills don't have to die with me. I've written down everything I know. Start with volume 1 and work forward. If you get stuck, the drawings will explain what the words can't. The wood will teach you the rest, if you let it." May sat down on the floor of the small room. She sat there for a long time. She thought about a man she'd never met, who had spent the last years of his life building this room and filling it with everything he knew, sealing it behind a stack of old barrels in a covered passage, in a shop that had sat empty for 16 years, waiting. She thought about the barrels standing neatly in front of the door. She thought about the hinges, still oiled. He had known someone would eventually move the barrels. He had known that whoever was willing to move them was probably the kind of person who was looking carefully at the space they'd bought. He had left the hinges oiled because he wanted the door to open easily when the right person arrived. She picked up Volume 1. Frances Ulmer, when May brought her to the room 2 days later, stood at the door and looked at the shelves for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "He mentioned he was documenting. I thought he meant the client records." She moved to the technical drawings and lifted the edge of the top sheet and looked at the stave geometry diagram beneath it. He was the third generation of his family to work this trade. His grandfather learned it in Germany and brought it over. Aldous always said there were maybe 40 working coopers left in the country who still did it the old way, by hand. He said the knowledge was going to disappear and he didn't know what to do about that except write it down. May said, "He wrote down everything." Frances turned to look at her. "What are you going to do with it?" May thought about it for a moment. She said, "I'm going to learn it first, then I'll figure out what comes next." She had been saying versions of that sentence for weeks now, and she was beginning to understand it was not a delay. It was a method. She started with Volume 1 on a Monday and by Friday had read it twice. She read with a pencil in her hand, marking passages she didn't yet understand, drawing connecting lines to the technical drawings she'd begun to spread across the main workbench in sequence. She made her first stave on a Saturday. Rough, imprecise, the edge bevel off by more degrees than she wanted to admit, and held it up in the light and studied where it had gone wrong and made another one. Court Ulmer, who had been watching the lights in the shop stay on past 10 o'clock most nights, came by on a Tuesday with a hydraulic lift he said he had no use for, and which happened to be exactly the right height for moving large barrel forms without destroying one's back. He did not explain how he had known this. He set it inside the door and said, "Let me know if you need anything else," and left. May was beginning to understand that Court communicated primarily through objects. She made her first complete barrel in March, a 3-gallon aging cask, white oak, hand-staved, hooped with iron rings she'd hammered herself on the anvil she'd found behind the steam box. It held water. She knew it held water because she filled it from the spigot in the yard and left it for 48 hours and found it unchanged. She looked at it for a long time, the same way she had looked at the first barrel form she'd moved, with the careful inventory of a person trying to understand what they're actually seeing. She was not expecting what happened next. She had taken 3 photographs of the finished cask and posted them on a simple online listing she'd created, mostly because the library had a class on selling handmade goods online, and she had attended it on the principle that information is never wasted. She had priced the cask modestly, uncertain of what the market would bear, and had written a short description of the shop's history and what she was doing there, and had included 1 photograph of the covered room and its shelves, not thinking much about it. By the end of the week, she had 47 inquiries. A distillery in Kentucky wrote to ask if she produced full-sized aging barrels and what her lead time was. A wine cooperative in the Willamette Valley wrote to ask about French oak casks and whether she worked to custom specifications. A heritage craft organization based in Vermont wrote to ask if they could feature the documentation archive in a forthcoming publication on endangered American trades. A man in Maine who had been trying to find a working hand cooper for 3 years for a project involving traditional saltfish barrels wrote 3 separate emails and apologized for the repetition. May sat at the workbench with her phone and read the inquiries one by one, and then set the phone down and walked through the shop and through the covered passage and stood in the doorway of the small room with its shelved ledgers and drawings and stave samples. She went back to the bench and started reading Volume 2. She answered the inquiries carefully, one by one, over several days. She was honest. She had only recently begun. She was working through the documentation. She could not yet make a full-sized production barrel to the standard she intended, and was not going to pretend otherwise. She asked the distillery to give her 6 months and then make contact again. She told the wine cooperative the same. She told the Heritage Craft organization she would be glad to contribute to their publication when she had something worth contributing. She told the man in Maine she would write to him specifically when she felt she was ready for his project, because his project sounded like exactly the kind of work the shop had been built for. He wrote back immediately and said he would wait. The months that followed had the quality of time spent doing something difficult and absorbing. The hours were long, and the progress was incremental, and each day ended with the pleasant exhaustion of a body and mind that had been fully used. She made barrel after barrel, each one better than the last by small degrees that she could see when she laid them side by side and sighted along the staves. Court brought a length of fence rail she hadn't asked for and couldn't immediately explain the purpose of, which turned out to be exactly the right diameter for the stave-bending jig she'd been trying to improvise from inadequate materials. Frances brought food in the way that water runs, regularly, without ceremony, as if it were simply part of the landscape. She hired a woman named Bev to help with the correspondence and invoicing. Bev was 61, had been doing office work since before May was born, arrived on her first day, looked at the papers on the desk and said, "I'll need a filing system in 3 days," and had both done by the end of the week. A professor of material culture at a mid-Atlantic university found the Vermont organization's article and wrote to inquire about the archive. He came in person in September and spent 2 days with the ledgers and drawings, and on the second morning he came to find May at the bench, where she was working on a pair of quarter-cask bourbon barrels for the Kentucky distillery. He said, "Do you understand what he left you?" May set down the crow's plane. "I'm starting to." He said there were 7 active hand coopers in the United States he could document, all of them working from partial records or family transmission. What Aldous Vane had left in that room was the most complete technical documentation of traditional coopering practice he had encountered anywhere in North America. He paused. He knew what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. May said. She went back to the barrel. The word that traveled through Dunmore County about May Colton and the cooper's shop on Sutter Mill Road traveled the way such things travel, not as news but as common knowledge, the kind that accumulates until one day everyone seems to have always known it. People who drove past slowed out of habit. People who slowed eventually stopped. People who stopped came in, and some of them bought things, and some of them asked questions, and some of them had histories with the shop that May hadn't known about. An elderly man named Ward came in on a Thursday in October and stood in the middle of the floor without speaking long enough that May put down her tools and waited. He said his father had brought a broken cask to this shop in 1974. Aldous had fixed it in an afternoon and refused payment because May's father had once done him a small kindness, and Aldous said it was settled. "I never forgot that," Ward said. "You do something, you don't let the account run open. You close it." May said she thought that was a good way to live. He bought a small cask and carried it out under his arm. She wrote Ward's story in the order log alongside the transaction, the way Aldous had closed accounts with generosity rather than money. Bev found the notation and said nothing, which was how Bev communicated approval. May began closing accounts of her own, not financial ones, the other kind. She started leaving finished pieces with people who were struggling, not announcing it, not explaining it, just leaving a small cask or a decorative stavework piece on a porch, or tucking it under an arm and handing it over with a matter-of-factness that made acceptance easy. A family 3 roads over who had lost work and were making do. A woman in town who had been a steady customer at the hardware store for years, and whose husband had recently died and who appeared, when May saw her, to be carrying the specific weight of a person who is not sure the days have a point anymore. May left a small piece on her step on a Wednesday morning. She did not leave a note. She did not explain. She just left the thing. The woman found her at the winter market 2 weeks later and held both of May's hands and did not say anything for a moment, and then said, "I don't know how you knew, but you knew." May said, "Aldous Vane knew. I just learned it from him." The first person from her old life to make contact was Leela. She called in November, 16 months after May had left the farmhouse with a sleeping bag and $31. A reporter had filed a short piece in the county weekly after seeing the Heritage Craft Organization's article, and the piece had included a photograph of May at the main bench, the small room's shelves visible through the doorway behind her. Lila had seen it. Her voice carried the particular tone of a person hoping to be forgiven without quite naming what the forgiveness would be for. She said she was glad. She said she thought about May often. She said Birch was well, which was not information May had asked for. May said she was glad Leela had called. She said she hoped they would see each other sometime. She said it without coldness and without particular warmth, in the even temperature of someone who has settled a thing internally and no longer needs to revisit it out loud. Leela said goodbye. May said goodbye. Birch she never heard from. She had not expected to. The county weekly piece brought more inquiries than the online listing had. 3 were from local restaurants and small producers who wanted aging vessels and had not known, until the article, that anyone was making them within 100 miles. May answered each one honestly and fulfilled each order on a schedule that didn't pretend she was further along than she was. The Kentucky distillery reordered. The Maine Man Saltfish Barrel project began, a commission that took 4 months and produced 12 barrels she was genuinely proud of, sent north on a freight truck with a card inside each one that said Vane Cooperage, EST, 1961. Continued, she had chosen the word carefully. Not restored, not revived. Continued, it is 3 years now since May Colton drove down Sutter Mill Road and pulled over to look at a building she had found on a county delinquent property list. The cedars have been cut back, courts doing, on a Saturday in April, without being asked. The shop is visible from the road now. The double doors are both properly hung and painted the same deep red that Aldous Vane's original paint, still legible in one protected groove, turned out to be. The sign above the doors says Vane Cooperage. Bev runs the office 3 days a week. May has one apprentice. Owen, who came from the professor's program, had read every word of the archive before he arrived, and showed up able to ask questions that came from having done his reading. He is careful and absorbs instruction without resistance, which are the 2 things May has decided she requires. Volume 3 sits open on the main bench this week, beside a half-finished bourbon cask bound for Tennessee. Aldis's handwriting is familiar to her now in the way that a friend's handwriting becomes familiar. Absorbed rather than read. She still marks passages. She still draws connecting lines to the technical drawings. The penciled annotations and the ledger margins are layered now, his notes and hers, built over 16 years of silence. Continuing, the small room behind the barrel stack is unchanged. Its shelves hold everything they held when she found it, plus the growing record of her own years. The man in Maine sent a photograph of the saltfish barrels and wrote that his grandmother, 91, had said the barrels smelled right. May framed it and hung it on the wall of the small room. She goes there sometimes, in the early morning before anyone else arrives, when the light through the south windows is low and gold. She stands in the doorway and looks at the shelves and thinks about the hinges Aldous kept oiled, about the barrels standing neatly in front of a door that was always going to be found by whoever looked carefully enough. There is a kind of faith that doesn't have a name in most conversations. It is the faith of people who do good work in private and trust that the work will find its way to someone who needs it. Aldous Vane had it. He spent 41 years building something and then spent the last years of his life making sure it wouldn't vanish when he did, and he sealed the door and stood the barrels in front of it and waited. He didn't live to see May Colton move the barrels. He didn't live to see the casks going to Kentucky and the fish barrels going to Maine and the apprentice reading Volume 3 at the main bench on a Tuesday. But he had understood, in the way that people understand things they cannot quite articulate, but know in their bones, that the work would survive him if he wrote it down carefully enough and left the hinges oiled. May Colton was 19 years old and had $31 and a deed worth $1 and a life that had just been cleared of everything except what was necessary. She walked into a shop full of tools she didn't yet know how to use and found, behind a stack of old barrels, an instruction written for her by a man she'd never meet. The skills don't have to die with me. She made sure they didn't. She's still making sure. If this story meant something to you tonight, we'd love for you to share it with someone who might need it. And please subscribe to Quiet Road Stories if you haven't yet. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. And here is our question for you this evening. Has there ever been a person, someone you never met or barely knew, who left something behind that changed the direction of your life? A skill, a word, a thing they made or built or wrote down? Tell us about it in the comments. We read every one. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.